Mrs. Ruby, a retired teacher battling cancer, went to the park for a peaceful day. But she never expected her life to take such a dramatic turn. What happened next will leave you speechless. Stay with us until the end. This story will change the way you see the world. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Let's stand together for justice. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains of a small apartment, casting soft rays on the worn-out furniture and faded wallpaper. Muffled sounds from the busy street outside seeped in through the window cracks, blending with the rhythmic ticking of an old clock on the wall. Mornings had become increasingly difficult for Mrs. Ruby, a 70-year-old woman whose frail body bore the weight of both age and illness. She lay in bed for a few minutes longer, savoring the quiet moment before the harsh realities of the day settled in. Her joints ached as she sat up slowly, the familiar pain reminding her that cancer was steadily taking its toll on her body. Liver cancer. A diagnosis that had shattered her world and left her fighting an uphill battle she couldn't afford to win. After a few deep breaths, she reached for the pill bottles on her nightstand. Her thin fingers trembled as she unscrewed the cap of one bottle and poured out the prescribed dosage. The pills rattled against the glass, a stark reminder of the dependency she now had on medication. She swallowed them with a sip of water, her throat dry from the night's rest. As she did every morning, Ruby gazed at the framed photo on the nightstand. It was a picture of her younger self, standing outside the school where she had taught for over 30 years. Her eyes glimmered with pride in the photograph, reflecting the passion she once had for teaching children in her community. But that life seemed distant now, a fragment of a past she could never reclaim. Her savings, which should have lasted through her retirement, had quickly drained due to medical bills. The government assistance she relied on barely covered her rent and necessities, leaving nothing for the expensive treatments she desperately needed. Ruby sighed deeply, pushing herself to stand. Her hands gripped the edge of the bed for support as she steadied herself before sitting down in her wheelchair. She had been using it for the past 6 months. Though she had resisted it at first, her body's increasing weakness left her with no other choice. In the small kitchen, she prepared a simple breakfast, toast and a cup of tea. Her hands shook as she spread the butter on the bread, and the tea's warmth was comforting as she took a careful sip. The routine was mechanical, a way to keep her mind from wandering to darker thoughts. But as the minutes passed, her mind inevitably drifted back to her predicament. She couldn't afford the full course of chemotherapy her doctors recommended. The hospital visits were becoming more infrequent, not because she didn't need them, but because she didn't want to burden herself with more debt. Ruby didn't want to die in a hospital bed, hooked up to machines. She wanted to spend whatever time she had left with dignity, in her own home, surrounded by the few memories she held dear. After breakfast, Ruby decided she needed some fresh air. She hadn't been to the park in weeks, and the thought of hearing the birds and feeling the sun on her skin was enough to motivate her to leave the apartment. The doctors had warned her to avoid public spaces due to her compromised immune system, but she was tired of feeling like a prisoner in her own home. She grabbed a light shawl, draped it over her shoulders, and wheeled herself toward the door. The elevator ride down was slow and creaky, and when she finally reached the ground floor, she rolled out into the street with a quiet determination. The park was a few blocks away, and the journey there was a familiar one. She passed by the local grocery store where she used to shop, the library she often visited, and the cafe where she'd meet friends for tea. Most of those friends were gone now, either moved away or passed on. It was a sobering realization that she had outlived most of the people she cared about. When Ruby finally arrived at the park, she paused to take it all in. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves rustling like whispers of a forgotten time. The air smelled of grass and flowers, a stark contrast to the sterile scent of hospitals and medications. She wheeled herself along the paved path, enjoying the rare moment of peace. The sun warmed her face, and for the first time in days she felt a faint glimmer of contentment. She found a bench near the pond and parked her wheelchair beside it. Ducks glided gracefully across the water, their reflections shimmering on the surface. A group of children played nearby, their laughter filling the air. Ruby watched them with a bittersweet smile, remembering the joy she once felt as a teacher. She had dedicated her life to educating and nurturing children, believing that knowledge was the key to a better future. But now, sitting in her wheelchair, she wondered if her efforts had made any lasting impact. Lost in thought, she didn't immediately notice the man approaching from a distance. He was on a motorcycle, the engine's roar growing louder as he drew near. Ruby glanced up and felt a pang of unease. The man parked his bike a few feet away and dismounted, his gaze locked on her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. He was tall, muscular, and rough-looking, with a scowl etched into his face. His leather jacket bore patches that Ruby couldn't quite make out, but his entire demeanor exuded hostility. She quickly looked away, hoping he would move on, but the man didn't budge. Instead, he took a few steps toward her, his boots crunching on the gravel path. "Hey," he called out, his voice rough and abrasive. Ruby's heart began to race. She tried to maintain her composure, but the man's presence was unsettling. "Mind if I sit here?" he asked, gesturing toward the bench. Ruby nodded slowly, not wanting to provoke him. The man sat down heavily, the bench creaking under his weight. For a moment there was silence, broken only by the distant sound of children playing and birds chirping. Ruby tried to focus on the peaceful scene before her, but the man's gaze was unwavering. "You come here often?" he asked. Ruby didn't respond right away. She glanced at him briefly and noticed the way he was looking at her, like she was an unwelcome intruder in his space. "I used to," she finally said, her voice soft. "Not as much anymore." The man chuckled darkly. "Figures. You don't look like you belong out here." Ruby tensed at his words. There was something malicious in his tone, a hint of disdain that made her stomach twist. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, keeping her voice calm. The man shrugged. "Just saying. People like you don't belong in places like this." Ruby's hands tightened on the armrests of her wheelchair. She knew exactly what he meant. She had faced this kind of prejudice before, but it never got easier. "I have just as much right to be here as anyone else," she said firmly. The man's expression darkened. He leaned in closer, his voice lowering to a menacing whisper. "Maybe you do, but that doesn't mean I have to like it." Ruby's heart pounded in her chest. She looked around, hoping someone nearby would notice the tension, but most people were too absorbed in their own activities to pay attention. She was alone, vulnerable, and at the mercy of this stranger's hostility. The man stood up abruptly, towering over her. "You should leave," he said, "before someone makes you." Ruby met his gaze with quiet defiance. She wasn't going to be intimidated. Not now. Not after everything she'd been through. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. The man's scowl deepened, and for a moment Ruby wondered if he would act on his threat. Her grip tightened on the wheelchair's handles, ready to wheel herself away if necessary. But before anything else could happen, a figure appeared in the distance. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park's paved paths as Mrs. Ruby wheeled herself slowly along the familiar route. Her thoughts drifted between memories of better days and the persistent ache in her body, a constant reminder of her illness. She had come here for peace, but something felt different today. There was a chill in the air despite the warmth of the afternoon, a tension she couldn't quite place. As she moved past a group of children playing by the pond, her mind wandered back to her years as a teacher, back when she believed she could make a difference in the lives of her students. She had been proud of her work, proud of the way she encouraged young minds to dream beyond their circumstances. But now, those dreams seemed distant, lost beneath the weight of her current reality. Suddenly, the distant roar of an engine pierced through her thoughts. It grew louder, the deep rumble reverberating through the park's serene atmosphere. Mrs. Ruby glanced up, her gaze locking onto the source of the noise. A motorcycle sped down the narrow path, weaving between park-goers with reckless abandon. The man riding the bike was dressed in a leather jacket covered in patches, his helmet obscuring most of his face. As he approached, the bike slowed and he pulled over a few feet from where she sat, cutting the engine abruptly. Mrs. Ruby's heart quickened. Something about the man unsettled her. He removed his helmet, revealing a rough, weathered face with a sneer that seemed permanently etched into his features. His eyes scanned the park before landing squarely on her, and his lips curled into a mocking smirk. "Hey, lady," he called out, his voice rough and taunting. Mrs. Ruby averted her gaze, hoping he would lose interest and move on. But instead, the man strode toward her with deliberate steps, each footfall crunching on the gravel path. "I'm talking to you," he said, stopping directly in front of her wheelchair. Mrs. Ruby took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. She had dealt with hostility before, but something about this man felt different. There was a menace in his posture, a dangerous energy that made her uneasy. "I'm just here for some fresh air," she said softly, hoping to diffuse the situation. The man chuckled, a low, humorless sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "Fresh air, huh? Funny. Didn't think someone like you would show up in a place like this." Mrs. Ruby frowned. "Someone like me?" He shrugged, his smirk never faltering. "Yeah, you know what I mean." The implication was clear. She had heard those words before, always laced with the same venomous undertone. Her heart clenched, but she refused to let fear control her. She straightened her posture, meeting his gaze with quiet resolve. "I have just as much right to be here as anyone else," she said firmly. The man's expression darkened, and he took a step closer. "Maybe you do, but that doesn't mean everyone's happy to see you here." Mrs. Ruby's hands tightened on the armrests of her wheelchair. Her mind raced, considering her options. The park wasn't crowded enough for anyone to notice the confrontation, and most people were too far away to intervene. She needed to stay calm, to think clearly. "Please, leave me alone," she said. "I don't want any trouble." The man's smirk grew wider. "Trouble? Oh, I'm not the one causing trouble. I'm just saying what everyone else is thinking." He reached out and casually flicked the edge of her shawl, letting it fall from her shoulders to the ground. Mrs. Ruby's breath caught in her throat. The gesture was small, but it carried a weight of disrespect and malice that she couldn't ignore. She bent down slowly to retrieve the shawl, her movements deliberate and measured. As she straightened, she met his gaze once more. "I'm not afraid of you," she said quietly. The man's smirk faltered for a brief moment before returning with renewed intensity. "Maybe you should be," he said. Without warning, he reached out and shoved her wheelchair, causing it to lurch backward. Mrs. Ruby gasped, her hands gripping the armrest tightly as she fought to steady herself. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. The man laughed, the sound echoing through the empty space around them. "Just testing how tough you really are. You've got a big mouth for someone sitting in a chair." Mrs. Ruby's heart pounded in her chest. She knew she couldn't physically defend herself, but she refused to be intimidated. "You don't scare me," she said again, louder this time. The man's laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a cold, menacing glare. He took another step closer, his shadow looming over her. "Maybe you should learn when to keep quiet," he said, his voice low and dangerous. He raised his hand as if to strike her, but before he could act, a sharp voice cut through the tension. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Both Mrs. Ruby and the man turned to see a figure approaching from the distance. The newcomer walked with purpose, his gaze locked on the scene before him. It was Jason Statham. The man's confident stride and intense presence immediately shifted the atmosphere. The tension in the air crackled like static electricity as he closed the distance between himself and the confrontation. His sharp features were set in a serious expression, and his piercing gaze never wavered from the aggressor. The man beside Mrs. Ruby sneered. "Who the hell are you supposed to be?" Jason didn't answer right away. He stopped a few feet from the man, his posture relaxed but alert. There was a calm authority in his demeanor, an air of someone who had seen his fair share of trouble and knew exactly how to handle it. "I'm someone who doesn't like bullies," Jason finally said, his voice steady and measured. The man scoffed. "This ain't got nothing to do with you. Mind your own business." Jason's gaze shifted to Mrs. Ruby, taking in her disheveled appearance and the fear etched across her features. His jaw clenched and his eyes hardened. "This is my business," he said. The man's smirk returned. "Yeah? And what are you going to do about it?" Jason took a step closer, his movements deliberate and controlled. "I'll tell you what I'm not going to do," he said. "I'm not going to stand here and let you harass an innocent woman." The man bristled at Jason's words, his fists clenching at his sides. "You think you're some kind of hero?" he spat. Jason's expression didn't change. "I think I'm someone who knows right from wrong, and what you're doing, it's wrong." For a moment, the two men stood in tense silence, the air between them charged with unspoken challenges. Mrs. Ruby watched with bated breath, her heart racing as she waited to see what would happen next. Then, without warning, the man lunged at Jason, but Jason was ready. With practiced ease, he sidestepped the attack and grabbed the man's arm, twisting it behind his back with a precision that spoke of years of experience. The man cried out in pain, struggling to break free, but Jason held firm. "I think we're done here," Jason said calmly, guiding the man toward the ground. As the man writhed beneath his grip, Jason glanced at Mrs. Ruby. "Are you okay?" he asked. Mrs. Ruby nodded slowly, her voice shaky but determined. "Yes, thank you." Jason turned his attention back to the man on the ground. "Now," he said, his tone firm, "you're going to stay right there until the police arrive." The man muttered curses under his breath, but he didn't try to resist. Mrs. Ruby watched as Jason reached for his phone, dialing emergency services. For the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of hope. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting golden hues across the park as Jason Statham stood over the subdued man on the ground. His grip remained firm on the man's wrist, keeping him pinned down with little effort. The crowd that had gathered a few moments earlier had now grown larger, murmurs spreading through the onlookers as they pulled out their phones to record the scene unfolding before them. Jason ignored the cameras, focusing only on ensuring that the aggressor wouldn't get another chance to hurt Mrs. Ruby. His sharp gaze remained steady, his demeanor calm but unyielding. Mrs. Ruby sat quietly in her wheelchair, clutching the edges of her shawl as if trying to ground herself in the moment. Her mind was racing, replaying the events of the past few minutes. She hadn't expected anyone to come to her aid, especially not someone like Jason Statham. She recognized him almost immediately. His face, his voice, the way he carried himself. He was exactly as he appeared in the films she had watched over the years, fearless, controlled, and unwavering in the face of danger. Jason's phone was pressed to his ear as he spoke with the emergency dispatcher. His tone was clipped and professional as he relayed the situation. "Yes, I need officers and an ambulance at Lakeside Park. There's been an assault. The suspect is detained." He paused for a moment, glancing down at the man beneath him. "No, he's not going anywhere." The man squirmed on the ground, his sneer replaced by a grimace of pain and frustration. "You don't know who you're messing with," he growled through clenched teeth. "You think you're some kind of hero? You've got no right to put your hands on me." Jason remained unfazed. "I've got every right to stop someone from assaulting an innocent person." His voice was steady, calm, and carried an air of authority that left little room for argument. "You can explain yourself to the police when they get here." The man cursed under his breath, his eyes darting around the growing crowd. He seemed to realize that there was no way out of this situation. Cameras were everywhere, capturing his every move. His bravado began to falter as the weight of the consequences started to sink in. Mrs. Ruby finally found her voice, though it was soft and shaky. "Thank you," she said, her eyes meeting Jason's. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." Jason's expression softened slightly as he turned to face her. "No need to thank me. I just did what anyone should do." He glanced around at the crowd before continuing, his voice carrying a subtle edge of disappointment. Too many people stood by and did nothing. The crowd shifted uncomfortably at his words, some lowering their phones, ashamed of their initial inaction. Others continued recording, knowing that this video would soon make headlines. Jason crouched down beside Mrs. Ruby, his tone becoming gentler. "Are you hurt? Do you need medical attention?" Mrs. Ruby shook her head slowly. "I'm okay, just shaken." She hesitated before adding, "I've been through worse." Jason's brows furrowed slightly at her words, but he didn't press for more details. Instead, he offered her a reassuring nod. "The ambulance will be here soon. Let's make sure you get checked out, just in case." As they spoke, the distant wail of sirens echoed through the park, signaling the arrival of the police and medical responders. The crowd began to part, making way for the approaching vehicles. 2 police cruisers and an ambulance pulled up along the park's perimeter, their lights flashing brightly against the fading daylight. 2 officers stepped out of the first cruiser, their eyes scanning the scene before locking on to Jason and the man he had pinned down. One of the officers, a tall man with a stern expression, approached with cautious steps. His partner followed closely behind, her hand resting on the holster at her hip. "What's going on here?" the lead officer asked, his gaze shifting between Jason, the subdued man, and Mrs. Ruby. Jason released the man's wrist, standing to his full height and meeting the officer's gaze with unwavering confidence. "This man assaulted that woman," he said, gesturing toward Mrs. Ruby. "I intervened to stop him. Everything's on camera, and there are plenty of witnesses." The officer nodded slowly, his gaze narrowing as he studied the man on the ground. "Is that true?" he asked. The man sneered but said nothing, his eyes filled with defiance. He knew better than to incriminate himself further, but the evidence against him was already overwhelming. The female officer stepped forward, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," she ordered. The man hesitated for a moment before reluctantly complying. As the cuffs clicked into place, he shot a venomous glare at Jason. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath. Jason ignored the threat, his attention returning to Mrs. Ruby as the paramedics approached. One of the medics knelt beside her, gently checking her vitals and asking routine questions. "Do you feel any pain, ma'am? Any dizziness or shortness of breath?" the medic asked. Mrs. Ruby shook her head, her voice calm but weary. "No, I'm fine. Just a bit shaken." Jason stood nearby, watching intently as the medics worked. He felt a protective instinct toward the elderly woman, a desire to ensure that she was safe and cared for. There was something about her, the quiet strength in her eyes, the dignity with which she carried herself despite her vulnerable state, that resonated deeply with him. As the paramedics finished their assessment, one of them turned to Jason. "She seems stable, but we recommend taking her to the hospital for a full checkup." Mrs. Ruby shook her head firmly. "No hospitals. I'm fine." Jason frowned, sensing there was more to her refusal than simple stubbornness. He crouched down beside her once more, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Are you sure? It's important to make sure you're okay." Mrs. Ruby met his gaze, her eyes filled with a quiet determination. "Hospitals cost money. I've had enough of doctors and bills. I just want to go home." Jason's expression softened with understanding. He nodded slowly, respecting her decision. "Okay, but if you feel worse, promise me you'll get checked out." "I promise," Mrs. Ruby said softly. The police officers finished taking statements from witnesses, ensuring that they had copies of the videos recorded by bystanders. As the handcuffed man was led toward the police cruiser, he glanced back one last time, his gaze filled with resentment. Jason watched him go, his jaw tightening slightly. He knew that justice would take its course, but he also knew that people like that man didn't change overnight. The fight against hate and prejudice was far from over. Mrs. Ruby shifted in her wheelchair, drawing Jason's attention back to her. "Thank you again," she said, her voice warm with gratitude. "I don't know how to repay you." Jason shook his head. "You don't need to repay me. Just take care of yourself." She offered a faint smile, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You're a good man. We need more people like you in the world." Jason's lips quirked into a small smile. "We just need more people to stand up when it counts." As the ambulance and police cruisers pulled away, the crowd began to disperse. Jason stood with Mrs. Ruby for a moment longer, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The park was quiet once more, the chaos of the past hour fading into the stillness of the evening. But the impact of what had happened lingered in the air, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there were those who would step forward to bring light. The video of the incident spread like wildfire across social media. Within hours, the footage of Jason Statham intervening to protect an elderly black woman from a violent racist attack had gone viral. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as an act of heroism and humanity in the face of hatred. Comment sections overflowed with praise for Jason's actions, and people around the world expressed outrage at the attack on Mrs. Ruby. Words like bravery and inspiration were used to describe the moment, while others condemned the bystanders who had done nothing until Jason stepped in. The footage was shared millions of times, and hashtags supporting Mrs. Ruby and denouncing racism began trending globally. But for Mrs. Ruby, the sudden surge of attention was overwhelming. Sitting in her modest living room, she stared at her phone, which buzzed incessantly with notifications. Messages from strangers poured in, words of support, offers to help with her medical expenses, and stories from people who had experienced similar prejudice. It was touching, but also exhausting. She hadn't asked for this spotlight, nor did she feel comfortable being thrust into the center of a public narrative. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She wheeled herself to the entrance and opened it to find her neighbor, Maria, standing there with a concerned expression. "Ruby, have you seen the news?" Maria asked, holding up her phone with a video playing on the screen. "You're everywhere. People are talking about you all over the world." Mrs. Ruby sighed. "I've seen it. I'm not sure how to feel about it." Maria stepped inside, placing a comforting hand on Ruby's shoulder. "You should be proud. What happened to you was terrible, but you're showing people that they can't get away with this kind of behavior. You're giving others hope." "I never wanted to be a symbol," Mrs. Ruby said softly. "I just wanted to live my life in peace." Maria nodded in understanding. "I know, but sometimes we don't get to choose when we make a difference. It just happens." Later that evening, Mrs. Ruby sat in her armchair, gazing out the window at the quiet street below. The events of the past few days weighed heavily on her mind. She had spent most of her life trying to teach children to be kind, compassionate, and just. Yet here she was at 70 years old, still fighting the same battles she had fought decades ago. Her thoughts were interrupted by the ringing of her phone. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello? Mrs. Ruby? This is Lisa Thompson from Channel 9 News. We'd love to have you on our show to talk about what happened at the park. Your story has inspired so many people, and we think it's important to share your perspective." Mrs. Ruby tightened her grip on the phone. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm not sure I'm the right person for that. I'm just an old woman trying to get by." "With all due respect, you're more than that," Lisa replied. "You've become a voice for people who've experienced discrimination. Your story is important, and we want to help you share it." Mrs. Ruby remained silent, uncertain. The idea of appearing on television made her uncomfortable, but she couldn't ignore the fact that people were looking to her for guidance and hope. "I'll think about it," she finally said. "Thank you for the call." After ending the conversation, she leaned back in her chair, lost in thought. She never expected to find herself in this position, but perhaps Maria was right. Perhaps she had a duty to speak up, not just for herself, but for those who couldn't. The next morning, another knock at the door startled her. When she opened it, her eyes widened in surprise. Jason Statham stood on her porch, a warm smile on his face. "Good morning, Mrs. Ruby," he said gently. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Jason Statham," she said, still processing his presence. "What are you doing here?" "I wanted to check on you," he said. "After everything that happened, I couldn't stop thinking about you. Are you okay?" Mrs. Ruby gestured for him to come inside. "I'm as okay as I can be, given the circumstances." Jason sat down across from her, his expression sincere. "I saw the news. Your story has reached millions of people. They're listening to you, Mrs. Ruby. You have a chance to make a real impact." She shook her head. "I'm just an old woman with a lot of health problems. I'm not sure what I can do." Jason leaned forward, his gaze steady. "You've already done more than you realize. People see you as a symbol of resilience and dignity. They need someone like you to remind them that they're not alone in this fight." Mrs. Ruby studied him for a moment, taking in his words. "Why does this matter so much to you?" Jason's expression softened. "Because I've seen too much hate in the world. I've seen people hurt and marginalized for things they can't change. It's not right, and if I have a platform to help change that, I want to use it. But I can't do it alone. People need real stories, real voices." Mrs. Ruby felt a lump form in her throat. She hadn't expected such empathy from someone like Jason, a man she had only known through the big screen. "I've spent my whole life trying to teach people to be better," she said quietly. "Maybe it's time I start speaking up again." Jason nodded. "The world needs more people like you, and if you decide to speak out, I'll be right there to support you." As they sat in her living room, a sense of purpose began to stir within Mrs. Ruby. She realized that her voice still mattered, that she still had the power to make a difference. The fear that had gripped her for so long started to fade, replaced by a quiet determination. By the time Jason left, Mrs. Ruby had made up her mind. She would accept the invitation to speak on the news, not because she wanted fame or recognition, but because she knew that her story could help others. That evening, she stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her shawl. Her reflection stared back at her, the lines on her face telling the story of a life filled with both hardships and triumphs. "I'm not done yet," she whispered to herself. With newfound resolve, she prepared for what lay ahead, ready to face the world once more. The bright studio lights were harsh against Mrs. Ruby's eyes as she sat quietly in her chair, waiting for the interview to begin. Her hands rested on her lap, fingers nervously clasped together. The bustling noise of the news crew setting up around her faded into a dull hum, drowned out by the thoughts racing through her mind. She hadn't been in front of a camera in decades, not since her teaching days when local news occasionally covered school events. But this was different. This time, the entire world was watching. Jason Statham had accompanied her to the studio, staying behind the scenes to offer support. His presence gave her a sense of calm she hadn't expected. He had kept his promise to stand by her side, and that meant more to her than she could express. The producer gave a final countdown, and the host, a well-dressed woman with a practiced smile, turned toward the camera. "Welcome back to Channel 9 News. Today, we have a story that has touched the hearts of millions. You've all seen the viral video of the heroic act by actor Jason Statham. But the true heart of this story is Mrs. Ruby, a retired teacher who became the victim of a vicious attack in a local park. She's here with us today to share her experience and her message with the world." The camera shifted to focus on Mrs. Ruby, and the host offered a reassuring nod. "Mrs. Ruby, thank you for joining us." Mrs. Ruby took a deep breath, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "Thank you for having me." The host leaned in slightly, her expression sympathetic. "Millions of people have seen the video of what happened to you. Can you tell us, in your own words, what that day was like?" Mrs. Ruby's gaze dropped to her hands for a moment before she looked back up. "It started like any other day. I went to the park to enjoy some fresh air. I've been dealing with health issues, and sometimes it helps to get out of the house. I didn't expect to be confronted like that." Her voice wavered slightly as she recalled the moment the man had approached her. He saw me, and something about me angered him. I could see it in his eyes. I've seen that look before. It's a look that tells you you're not welcome, that you don't belong. The host's smile faded into a solemn expression. That must have been terrifying. Mrs. Ruby nodded slowly. It was. But I've faced worse in my life. I've faced prejudice before. I've been told I'm not good enough, that I don't deserve the same opportunities as others. You learn to endure it. But that day, I realized I'm tired of enduring. I don't want to stay silent anymore. The host's eyes softened with understanding. That's a powerful statement. What do you hope people take away from your story? Mrs. Ruby sat up a little straighter, her voice gaining strength. I hope people realize that hate and prejudice have no place in our world. We've come a long way, but incidents like this show that we still have a long way to go. It's not enough to stand by and watch. We all have a responsibility to speak out and protect each other. Behind the cameras, Jason watched intently. He could see the impact Mrs. Ruby's words were having on the crew members, many of whom nodded in agreement as she spoke. Her quiet dignity and strength resonated deeply. The host leaned forward. "You mentioned your health issues. Would you mind sharing more about what you're going through?" Mrs. Ruby hesitated for a moment before answering. "I have liver cancer. I've been fighting it for a while now. It's not easy, especially when you're on a fixed income. Medical bills pile up quickly, and there's not always help available." The host's expression turned even more sympathetic. "I'm so sorry to hear that. You've shown incredible strength despite everything you're facing." Mrs. Ruby offered a faint smile. "I've learned that strength comes from the people around you. I've had people like Jason who stepped in when I needed help most. And now I have the support of so many people I've never even met. That gives me hope." The host glanced at her notes before continuing. "Speaking of Jason, he's been very vocal about his admiration for you. How has his support impacted you?" Mrs. Ruby's smile grew warmer. "Jason's support means more than I can say. He didn't have to help me that day, but he did, and he's continued to stand by me even when the cameras aren't around. That kind of kindness and commitment is rare." The host turned to the camera. Jason Statham has become a household name not just for his films, but for his actions in real life. His intervention that day made a difference, and it's clear he continues to make a difference off-screen. She returned her attention to Mrs. Ruby. "Do you have a message for those watching right now?" Mrs. Ruby took a moment to gather her thoughts. "Yes. To anyone watching, I want you to know that your voice matters. It doesn't matter how old you are, what you look like, or where you come from. You have the power to make a difference. Don't be afraid to stand up for what's right. And if you see someone in need, don't hesitate to help. We all have a role to play in making this world a better place." The host nodded appreciatively. "Thank you, Mrs. Ruby. Your words are truly inspiring." As the interview wrapped up, the producer signaled that the segment was over. The host turned to Mrs. Ruby with a warm smile. "Thank you again for being here. Your story is going to change lives." Mrs. Ruby nodded graciously. "I hope so." Once the cameras stopped rolling, Jason approached her, his expression filled with pride. "You did amazing," he said, kneeling beside her chair. "You spoke from the heart, and that's what people needed to hear." Mrs. Ruby reached out and took his hand. "Thank you for everything, Jason. I couldn't have done this without you." Jason shook his head. "You've had this strength all along. I just helped you see it." As they left the studio, Mrs. Ruby couldn't help but notice the way people looked at her with newfound respect. Strangers approached to shake her hand, thanking her for sharing her story. It was humbling and overwhelming, but it also filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. Later that evening, as she sat at home, Mrs. Ruby's phone buzzed with more messages of support. Donations began pouring into a fundraising page set up in her name, with people from all walks of life contributing to help cover her medical expenses. It was more than she ever expected, and it brought tears to her eyes. But what touched her most were the messages from people who shared their own stories of facing discrimination and finding the courage to stand up. Her story had sparked a movement, one that she hadn't anticipated but now felt compelled to continue. Mrs. Ruby knew that her journey was far from over. There would be more battles to fight, more voices to amplify. But for the first time in a long while, she felt hope. Not just for herself, but for the future she had always believed in. A future where kindness and compassion would triumph over hate. And as she sat in the quiet of her living room, she whispered the words she had once spoken to her students so many years ago. "The world changes when we choose to change it, one voice at a time." The crowd outside City Hall was larger than Mrs. Ruby had anticipated. People of all ages, races, and backgrounds had gathered, holding signs that read messages of unity, justice, and hope. Some held her picture. Others waved banners with quotes from her recent interview. Mrs. Ruby sat in her wheelchair at the edge of the crowd, watching in quiet awe as more people continued to arrive. She never imagined that her story would inspire such a movement, but here they were, hundreds of people who had come together to take a stand against hatred and discrimination. Jason Statham stood beside her, his protective presence a constant comfort. He had insisted on accompanying her to this event, ensuring that she felt safe and supported. As they waited for the speeches to begin, he leaned down to speak quietly to her. "You okay, Mrs. Ruby?" She nodded, though her hands trembled slightly in her lap. "I'm okay, Jason. Just overwhelmed." Jason smiled softly. "That's understandable. But look at what you've done. All these people are here because of you. You've given them hope." Mrs. Ruby glanced at the crowd again, her eyes scanning the sea of faces. There were parents with children, elderly couples holding hands, students, activists, and everyday people who had been moved by her story. She saw tears in some eyes, determination in others. It was a sight that filled her heart with both pride and humility. As the crowd quieted, the mayor of the city stepped up to the podium. His voice carried over the speakers, thanking everyone for attending and acknowledging the importance of the moment. "Today, we come together not just to denounce hate, but to celebrate resilience and humanity. One woman's story has reminded us all of the power of compassion and the courage it takes to stand up against injustice. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mrs. Ruby." The applause that followed was deafening. Jason gently placed his hand on Mrs. Ruby's shoulder. "It's time." With Jason's help, she moved toward the podium, her wheelchair rolling steadily across the platform. The crowd's cheers grew louder as she reached the microphone. Taking a deep breath, Mrs. Ruby looked out at the faces before her. For a moment, her voice caught in her throat, but she quickly steadied herself. "Thank you," she began, her voice strong despite the emotion behind it. "Thank you all for being here today. I never imagined I'd be standing here well, sitting here, speaking to so many people, but I'm grateful beyond words for your support." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the crowd. "A few weeks ago, I went to the park simply to enjoy the fresh air. I didn't expect to be confronted by hatred. I didn't expect to be attacked. But more importantly, I didn't expect that anyone would come to my defense. Jason Statham stepped in to help me when I needed it most, and I'll be forever thankful for his bravery. But what I want you all to know is that it shouldn't take a celebrity to stop an act of hate. It should be all of us. Every single one of us has the power to make a difference." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Mrs. Ruby continued, "I've lived through many decades. I've seen progress, and I've seen setbacks. But what I know for sure is that change doesn't happen by accident. It happens when ordinary people decide that enough is enough. It happens when we choose kindness over cruelty, courage over fear, and love over hate." She took a moment to steady her breath, the weight of her words hanging in the air. "I'm not a politician. I'm not a public figure. I'm just a woman who believes that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. And I'm standing here today because I refuse to let hate have the final word." The crowd erupted into applause once again, but Mrs. Ruby raised her hand gently, signaling for quiet. "But this isn't just about me. This is about all of us. It's about the people who have been silenced for too long. It's about the voices that need to be heard. It's about the children who should grow up in a world where they don't have to fear being judged for the color of their skin, their background, or their beliefs." She glanced at Jason, who gave her an encouraging nod. "And it's about those who came before us, the teachers, the activists, the leaders, who fought for a better future. We owe it to them to keep fighting. We owe it to ourselves. And we owe it to the next generation." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on her every word. "I've spent my life teaching children to believe in their worth, to stand up for what's right, and to treat others with kindness. Today, I'm asking all of you to do the same. Be the person who steps in when someone is in danger. Be the voice that speaks out against injustice. And most importantly, be the change you wish to see in the world." Tears welled in her eyes as she delivered her final words. "We can't change the past, but we can shape the future. And I believe that together we can create a future filled with hope, compassion, and justice for all." The crowd erupted into a standing ovation, the sound echoing through the streets. Mrs. Ruby sat quietly, letting the emotion wash over her. Jason stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder once again. "You did it," he said softly. Mrs. Ruby smiled through her tears. "We did it." As the applause continued, Mrs. Ruby looked out at the sea of faces once more. She saw hope. She saw strength, and she saw a promise of a better tomorrow. Later that evening, back at her apartment, Mrs. Ruby sat quietly by the window, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. Her phone buzzed with notifications, messages of gratitude, stories from people who had been inspired by her speech, and offers of support for her medical expenses. But it wasn't the recognition that mattered to her. It was the knowledge that she had made a difference. Jason sat across from her, sipping a cup of tea. "You've started something big, Mrs. Ruby. People are listening." She nodded slowly. "It's not about me. It's about all of us." Jason smiled. "That's what makes it so powerful." For the first time in a long while, Mrs. Ruby felt at peace. Her journey wasn't over. There were still battles to fight, still stories to share, but she no longer felt alone in her fight. As she gazed out at the city, a quiet determination settled in her heart. The world was changing, slowly but surely, and she would be there every step of the way, helping to shape a future where love and kindness triumphed over hate. Because one voice, no matter how small, could ignite a movement. And Mrs. Ruby's voice was far from finished. This story reminds us that one voice can spark change, and one act of courage can inspire thousands. If Mrs. Ruby's story moved you, don't stay silent. Speak out against hate. Stand up for justice and spread kindness wherever you go. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Together, we can make a difference.